So welcome back to our final module, excuse me, of Unit 3, Biological Basis of Behavior. We are on Module 15, Evolutionary Psychology, Understanding Human Nature. And I do apologize, my dog is sleeping in the background and he's snoring a little bit, so hopefully it won't be too loud. Okay, so I'm sure you have some ideas about evolution, and I want to sort of let you know that this discussion is about how genetics and environment interact, leading to changes in genetics to fit the environment. And it's also going to be about how traits that lead to survival are more likely to be passed down. So in the last module, we were talking about behavioral genetics and how that topic explores the genetic and environmental roots of human differences. So to contrast that, evolutionary psychologists focus kind of on the things that make us more alike as humans. And a lot of it is based on the principles of someone you've probably heard of, Charles Darwin. So we're going to talk a bit about his principle of natural selection and, how it was probably one of the most kind of momentous ideas that ever occurred in the human mind, at least according to Richard Dawkins. So we are going to look at our learning targets for Module 15. At the end of this module, you should be able to discuss evolutionary explanations for male-female differences in sexuality and mating preferences. So you can see we're going to probably be talking about some things that are a little bit controversial. You should be able to describe evolutionary psychologists' use of natural selection to explain behavioral tendencies, be able to explain the key criticisms of evolutionary explanations of human sexuality, and understand a little bit about how those evolutionary psychologists respond to those criticisms. And as we go through this, you'll be able to probably pick up on why there are some controversies within what the evolutionary psychologists say. And then you should also be able to understand the biopsychosocial approach to development that we've touched upon earlier on in Unit 1. So who's this guy? Charles Robert Darwin. You probably could even recognize him by picture maybe. He's pretty famous. He was an English naturalist, geologist, and biologist. He is definitely best known for his contributions to science in his study of evolution and for his, I can remember learning about his travels on the HMS Beagle. His proposition is that all species of life have descended over time from common ancestors, and this is now widely accepted within the scientific world and considered a foundational concept in science. And what I want you to think about is how Charles Darwin's ideas relate a lot back to probably one of the most famous psychologists of all time, William James. William James and the functionalists were highly influenced by Charles Darwin's writings. And that's something that I really want you to be thinking about when you're trying to connect Charles Darwin to psychology in general, beyond just the evolutionary psychology. Be thinking about William James, who is one of the most famous psychologists of all time. It had a profound impact on the field of psychology and still does. His writings still do have a profound impact. So another really interesting fact about Charles Darwin is that he was also half cousins with Sir Francis Galton, who you may remember, who was widely known for his studies on intelligence and individual differences. He was sort of a polymath in general who studied many different things, but he was known primarily for his study of intelligence and, unfortunately, a little bit for his opinions on eugenics. So, but Francis Galton was half cousins with Charles Darwin. So one of the foundational concepts of Darwin's theory is that idea of natural selection. And this is the principle that inherited traits that better enable an organism to survive and reproduce in a particular environment will most likely be passed on to succeeding generations. So if they're in competition with other trait variations, the ones that are most sort of adaptable to the environment will most likely be passed on to succeeding generations. So over time, traits that give an individual or a species a reproductive advantage. So everything with evolutionary psychology is all about what is it that will make an individual or a group have more advantageous ability to mate and then reproduce, because it's all about passing your genes on to the next generation and so on. So over time, those traits that give an individual reproductive advantage are selected, and those are the ones that will prevail according to evolutionary psychologists. And there's been a lot of really interesting animal research to sort of test this out, and we're going to talk a little bit about it in regards to foxes. So what is a mutation? So nature has indeed selected advantageous variations from the new gene combinations produced at each human conception, but there are also sometimes mutations that occur, and mutations are random errors in gene replication that lead to a change. So these mutations can happen just randomly. So in terms of Charles Darwin's basic principles, we should be thinking about the ideas of, thinking about evolution in general. At the dawn of human history, our ancestors were facing some different questions like, who's on my side? Who's my enemy? Who should I mate with? How should I pick out who I'm going to mate with? What food should I eat? And somehow, some of the individuals did things that were more successful than others. So one example, if you are following along in the Myers textbook, that I found very relevant was the example that of sort of nausea that's experienced often in early pregnancy. That was probably, according to the evolutionary psychologists, this is something that is sort of a way to keep babies safe from their mother eating some sort of food that would be potentially damaging to the development of the baby, right? And I found this really relevant because I was someone with both of my pregnancies who was extraordinarily sick for the first 20 weeks of pregnancy. So I guess I just need to look back at that as an evolutionary adaptation. So, okay, the 4 basic principles of Darwin. Organisms' varied offspring compete for survival. So the different offspring of an organism actually compete with each other to survive. Certain biological and behavioral variations increase organisms' survival chances in their particular environment. Offspring that survive are more likely to pass their genes to the next generation. So that's really important to think about. Those, in terms of humans, those children that end up surviving are thought of to be more fit in the terms of Darwinian language, and they're more likely to then pass their genes on to the next generation. And over time, the population characteristics may change based on sort of which genes are chosen and to move on to succeeding generations. So how do foxes factor into this? So really interesting stuff. So over the last more than 40 years, it says 40 years, but I thought it was a little bit more than 40 years, 2 researchers in Russia have studied selectively bred foxes, okay? And these geneticists, they're Russian geneticists led by, I'm not good with Russian names, Lyudmila Trut. They've been running one of the most important, probably, biological experiments of the 20th and now into the 21st century. And this experiment was actually thought of by Trut's mentor, Dmitry Belyaev, who in 1959 began an experiment to study the process of domestication in real time. Fascinating stuff. If you have dogs at all, or any type of animal, if you have cats too, but I have dogs, and I have 2 very different kind of dogs. The one who's sleeping and snoring behind me is a golden doodle, 3/4 poodle. So his personality is very different than our other dog, who is mostly pit bull, but probably a little bit of lab. So those types of dogs were bred for very different reasons. And so they have some different personality characteristics that are very interesting to see as they unfold. So Today, the domesticated foxes at this farm, there's an experimental farm in Siberia where they're still looking at these foxes. And what happened was that these researchers bred the tamest foxes they could, and they were able to produce docile, eager to please domesticated animals. So kind of learned that psychological traits can be selected as well as those physical traits. Can you imagine if you were the researcher who was trying to come up with the fox personality test? Would that be a self-report or an interview? Apparently this was done by measuring responses to attempts to feed them, handle them, stroke them. And it was measured, like probably the foxes that sort of growled or snarled less were continually the ones that were chosen and bred, and they produced the tamest foxes. And now the foxes are really pretty tame and very weirdly dog-like, and they're domesticated, and they're like calm like lap dogs. So really interesting stuff that this research that they've been doing in Russia, and it's still ongoing. So nature has indeed selected advantageous variations from different gene combinations and produced at each human conception, plus those mutations we talked about, those random errors in replication. But and we can see it very well in different types of animals and types of dogs that are retrievers, or those dogs that are herders, different types of cats and they're pouncing, or looking at different types of bird behavior. But the sort of the constraints on humans are a little bit looser. The genes selected during our ancestral history seem to be a little bit, like I said, looser. They give us a great capacity to learn, and therefore we're able to sort of adapt to life in many different environments, from the tundra to the jungle, as it says here. Our historical genes give us a great capacity to learn and to adapt. Okay, so we can live in many different types of environments. Genes and experience together wire the brain. So it's our genetics, like we just talked about in the last module, our nature and our nurture together wire the brain and determine who we end up being, who we are. Our adaptive flexibility in responding to different environments contributes to our fitness. And this is a little bit of a different usage of the word of fitness than you're probably used to. It does not mean, going to work out. It means our ability to survive and reproduce. And that's within evolutionary psychology, Darwinian theory. It's all about our ability to survive and reproduce and pass on our genes to the next generations. So here's some of the controversial stuff. What do evolutionary psychologists believe about male-female sexuality differences? Well, obviously what I'm going to read is fairly controversial. Evolutionary psychology says that males tend to be more likely to initiate sexual activity, not across the board, but they believe that in general, males are more likely to desire sexual activity than females. And that sometimes males may perceive women's friendliness for sexual interest, that this is an occurrence across cultures and across species, actually. So females, a lot of evolutionary psychologists believe, have a tendency to desire men with certain physical characteristics and certain personality characteristics as well. There's a lot of research on this kind of stuff, trying to figure out what type of body build that men prefer versus women and those kind of things. But it is a controversial area of study, but it is an important part of the field of evolutionary psychology. So social learning theorists sort of counter the ideas of the evolutionary psychologists, and they believe that much of who we are is learned through social scripts, these culturally modeled guides for how to act in various situations. So instead of believing it's some sort of evolutionary adaptation, social learning theorists believe that these things are learned through our culture. So things like we have scripts that tell us how to eat, how to take a seat, read a menu, order, all those different things. And scripts that give us indications of how men and women are supposed to act, how elderly and young people are supposed to act, and things like that. So What are some of the criticisms of the evolutionary perspective on sexuality? Well, they start with the effect and sort of work backward to explain what happened by using their theory. They also try to explain today's behavior with decisions that were made thousands of years ago. Again, it's sort of looking backwards, trying to figure out why our current behaviors are happening based on sort of how we've evolved over time. And truly, there are social consequences to accepting evolutionary explanations. You know, it's a little bit controversial to say that men and women have some of these differences, especially in regards to their desire for sexual intercourse and stuff like that. These are controversial things that make the field of evolutionary psychology one that is a little bit more prone to controversy in different areas of study. So evolutionary psychologists, of course, respond to these criticisms, and they say things like, much of who we are is not hardwired. They remind us that genes are not destiny, and even though men and women do have differences, that they have many more similarities than differences. And that some traits and behaviors are just hard to explain in terms of natural selection. So there are things that are just difficult to kind of fit into the theory, and they admit that some things are hard. So what about the biopsychosocial approach to development? We just want to keep coming back to this idea because it's really important and sort of where psychology is at this point. That it's genes, environment, and our culture that all combine to influence our development. And this is actually an image that we saw earlier on in our Unit 1. So, a little bit of a learning check here. The interaction of biological influences, psychological influences, and sociocultural influences on our behavior is known as, hopefully this one was pretty easy, C, the biopsychosocial approach. So you can see biological, psychological, and sociocultural. So that's an important term to keep remembering as we move through this course, the biopsychosocial approach. So let's review our learning targets. The first one was to describe the evolutionary psychologist's use of natural selection to explain behavioral tendencies. Evolutionary psychologists consider how natural selection, from the Darwinian theory, results in traits being passed on to future generations through genetics. Some genetic variations arise from those mutations, others from new gene combinations at conception. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution anticipated today's application of evolutionary principles in psychology. Okay, learning target 2, discuss evolutionary explanations for male-female differences in sexuality and mating preferences. So women tend to be more selective in general than men when choosing sexual partners. Evolutionary psychologists reason that men's attraction to multiple healthy, fertile-appearing partners increases their chance of spreading their genes widely. And again, this is extremely controversial. Women search for mature mates who will share child-rearing with them, increasing the odds of the offspring's survival, according to evolutionary psychologists. So what are some criticisms of evolutionary psychologists and their views on human sexuality? So again, they start with an effect and they work backward to an explanation. They don't recognize social and cultural influences probably enough. And there's a concern that what they're saying is it, kind of absolves people from taking responsibility for their own sexual behavior, which is extremely problematic. And we do know from the field of behavioral genetics that genes are not destiny. So learning target 15-3, explain the key criticisms of evolutionary explanations of human sexuality. This one's just continued from the last one. Evolutionary psychologists agree that genes are not destiny, and respond that understanding our predispositions can help us overcome them. So they would say, we don't really believe that genes are destiny. We say that they're important, and it explains a lot about how our behaviors are manifesting, but that we can think about it and understand our predispositions and overcome them, even though, you know, men may have certain likelihood of acting in a certain way versus women who have a likelihood of acting in a different way. We can sort of overcome them because we can think about it and change our behavior. They also cite the value of testable predictions based on evolutionary principles, which is, of course, the scientific goal of evolutionary psychology. And finally, describe the biopsychosocial approach to development. So this should be a bit of a review. Biological, a shared human genome, individual variations, prenatal environment, and sex-related genes, hormones, and physiology. Those are all the things that are tied together within the biological portion. Psychological, those gene-environment interactions, effective early experiences, responses evoked by our own characteristics, sort of the nature of our nurture, and personal feelings, beliefs, and expectations. And then finally, the social cultural. Our parental and peer influences affect us, our cultural traditions and values, and cultural gender norms. All of these things, according to the biopsychosocial model, are what are driving our development. So it's not just one area, it's all of these things working together. So hopefully we're now at the end of Unit 3, biological basis of behavior, and you will now hopefully really understand that biology and psychology are inextricably linked together. And, you know, hopefully there's an understanding that where there is variation, natural selection, and heredity, there will also be some evolution happening. Our genes form us, but our environment shapes us as well. So it's this combination, this mixture of our genes forming us and then having environmental differences shaping who we end up becoming. So, and that is the end of Module 15 in Unit 3. Thank you so much for listening. Take care.